goes, I'm not completely prepared, and I'm now feeling all the sugar in my body. So I'm gonna try not to go too fast, but we'll see how that goes. And my topic today, as some of you may see or may not see by the cutoff titles on those half sheets, is soil ecology of Western Washington. And just a preface beforehand, there's a lot that I could talk about for soil ecology. Obviously, for any ecology source or any ecosystem talking about, you can dive into a lot of different details about stuff. You know, there's an entire book right there that I could be reading to you, but I'm not going to. Instead, I decided to pick just a few little things that I thought were really interesting and that are specific to the soil ecosystems that we have in Western Washington. Talking about those. So I'm going to go through basically some, and specifically you can say for Western Washington soils. So just thinking about what you think about them beforehand, what maybe you've learned about them, maybe what you think or know are their impacts on the soils and their roles in the ecosystem, and just kind of any ideas you have about them. So just take a couple minutes, write about that, and then we'll come back together. Anyone want to raise their hand or shout out anything that they had? I will call on people.
Introduced species.
Say that again?
They're an introduced species.
They are an introduced species. That is true. And that goes perfectly into what I'm going to be talking about next. But any other things that people want to say else about worms, earthworms, anything they have said?
I got a question.
You got a question? Yeah.
Are they called European night crawlers, or am I just making that up?
That is a species of earthworms. Yes. And that is another good thing. They are European. That's a good distinguished thing. Anyone else have anything? Yes?
He said marine. I'm going to honor that.
Boom, back to you.
They eat dead organic matter and they keep it out as living.
That is a good point. Yeah, so basically we kind of think about how worms work. They're not like other burrowing animals where you have a mole and they're pushing stuff to the side and they're digging around, you make little mounds and they pop up. Earthworms, when they're moving through the soil, they're just basically mouth open and then just taking everything in, and that's just how they're moving through. You know, they're just going right through it, and everything's passing through. They're picking up anything they want, and they're eating anything they go through. They're just literally taking the soil in. So that could be organic material, and there's a lot of worms that stick to primarily the top layers of the soil and just eat the decaying plant life and stuff like that. But then there's also deep diving soil worms that will just take in the soil itself, and they'll be ingesting minerals, rocks, little bits like that. But then they do end up creating these things called casts, which is a term on the sheet you can see, which is basically just their poop. That's what they poop out, casts. And Maria was right there, really rich processed soil, and that's why we can define worms as shredders. So they're just like any other sort of shredding insect that will go in, take a larger organic material or something like that, and then shred it up, reduce it to a smaller size, compact it, and make it available for other smaller life forms or plant life to take those nutrients as well. Any other last thoughts? Anything else, Kate? You had something?
I was the different species of earthworms occupy different niches and layers of the soil.
That is
I
true.
had a little vermiculture experiment in my kitchen, and it might be dead.
Yeah, that is another true thing. We're going to be talking about that later. We can look at a few things of just showing the different types of worms and where different areas in the soils that they inhabit. But now, going back to the idea that we first talked about, that they are an introduced species. That is true. Fun fact, every earthworm that you see crawling around in these soils and anywhere here around Sioux or anything like that are not native to this area for some time. And it was already said before that they could be called European night crawlers, and that is where they come from. Like many introduced species, they were introduced through colonization of the continents about 500 years ago and so on. And specifically for earthworms, it occurred during transportation of soils, plants, other things of just bringing them over. Or another thing that I didn't even think about and realize was fishing bait. Was they would just be brought over as fishing bait, used, and then either they'd be dead or alive, or they would just be tossed to the side of the road or by the pond, and then they would just basically be these huge amounts of earthworms thrown into a barren community of soil, and they can take that over. So, does anyone know why we don't have any native earthworms here to begin with? Is there anything that we think have happened? Have they been here before? Did they get taken away? Did they move? Did they migrate and never come back? Any ideas?
Probably not true at all, but every single time it rains super hard, we see the fact that they all come up from underground, that they're going to drown. It has to do with our climate.
Ooh, that is a good thing. I will get into that later about our climate and how it is special towards soil critters. But specifically, I'm thinking about a natural event that occurred here thousands of years ago that would have affected soil ecology. Zach?
Was it the big flood?
It's not the big flood, but close. It was a big flood, but just on ice. So yeah, we can credit the last glacial advance, last glacial ice sheet that came through North America for the reason why we don't have any native earthworms in our soils, and that can be just the reason that once it came through, a mile of ice turned the ground into permafrost. Not a great system for a worm to be living in. It's not able to get anything out of it. So
Worms before?
there were native earthworms in Washington and Western Washington and northern states before the glacial advance. But then after that, it completely decimated the land and pushed their range down to the southern states. So, and there still are ones in North America. So it's not like saying that there are no native earthworms in North America. It's just for the glaciated states and areas. And it's not the entire state. For like us, the glacier got about as far down as Tacoma, that area, and in places that the glacier didn't affect, like the Olympics, there are still native earthworms in those areas. But in some states like Minnesota that were completely covered by the glacial advance, there are no native earthworms in that entire state, and that is where you can see a lot of the research being done on the non-native European earthworms moving into those systems. So let me just look through down. They did that. Blah, blah, blah. We talked about what earthworms kind of are, and then we can go into now of what they actually do for our soils. Would people say that earthworms, by just raise of hand, are important for soil ecology? Yeah, really important. What do they do specifically to help soil ecology? Does anyone know? It was kind of talked about before. Compost. Yeah, they're really good at composting material. They're those shredders, and they're really they're not better than other species, but they do it at a higher rate and more efficiently because they're not just moving stuff around and then eating some of the stuff. They're just eating everything. So every soil that comes in contact and moves through them is being turned into these casts of rich organic and non-organic material that is helping develop the soil in sorts of ways. So that's one way that they go about it. See, they're also a big thing they do is just by creating the tubes that they move through. A big thing about soil development is getting the turnover in soil and having it aerate and having water move through it. So you can think of water, slowly moving down through soil, and it's moving through all the little pores and cracks in between the soil particles. But if you have an earthworm that just burrows straight down, it just creates a great highway for all the water to shoot down into there, get into those lower areas, and that's really important for soil development when we're talking about chemical weathering and moving of nutrients in a soil complex, because through the water being down there in those lower levels is how a lot of plants and trees are able to suck in the nutrients because they need it in the water solution. So that's really important, and also aerating, just moving soil back and forth, because in soil ecology and the soil profile, which we won't get really into because that's a whole nother lecture, it's really good for soil development to have the turnover from topsoil to the lower levels of soil. So if you have a little guy burrow down, you just have a little tiny grain of soil, plops all the way down, maybe if it's only a foot down there, that's huge. That's a huge geological event of that little tiny grain of soil plopping down in there, and that's just that turnover rate. Since they're non-native, and so often when we talk about non-native species entering North America from colonial advances, there is that another phrase that goes along with it of them being invasive species. Show of hand, does anyone think that earthworms, European earthworms, are invasive species? No? I'm seeing some nods, I'm seeing some confusion, no one knows what I'm talking about. So there is sort of a debate about whether or not that they are invasive species or not, and really we define if it's invasive species if it is coming into an area that it's not native to and taking over the ecosystem and impeding on the growth and wellness of other life forms in those areas, which we can see in some cases. Like I was saying, in Minnesota, there's been a lot of research done about how the introduction of the earthworms have affected the soil ecology overall. Generally, when earthworms enter a soil, they will make it slightly more acidic just over time, and just that slight change in acidity in the pH scale, as we know, can change and have great ramifications. It can determine what can grow there, how well things grow, and just not from just the low-story plants, but all the way up to the trees and what can, how well they're doing. And in Minnesota, there have been studies shown where they will take a plot of land and introduce earthworms to it, and then just over a few yearly cycles will show a huge decrease in the low-lying plant life and the grasses, and that's just mainly from what they know. So, yeah. It's kind of hard to think about for them of whether or not they are invasive or not, because their effects haven't been shown to be, as major as we think of other invasive species like English ivy that would come in and just completely take over, scenes. It's hard for us to see because they're low into the ground. We can't really see the effects of it that well, and it comes into the question of, well, they're not necessarily coming in and kicking out other species. There's no natural native earthworms in these lands that are, being impeded on or outcompeted or, going for extinction. They were already cleared out through a natural event, and then you basically just had this barren land, this barren soil without any worms in them, and then they were just introduced. So it's kind of that question of whether or not, on the time scale of what is a native species and what is a non-native species. And so that's just something that, if I had more time, we could discuss greater on of what the ramifications are and how we label and perceive those different things. But it's not that big of a deal for us. And that's because, as Sydney said earlier, our climate is not that good for worms. Oddly enough, when we think about soil ecology, we think of like, oh yeah, there's a ton of worms and there's a ton of critters on the ground. But actually, for our climate and our soil type that we have, it's not that well suitable for soil critters and any sort of things, including worms. And Sydney pointed out a couple things with the rain. Is there any other factors that we think that could be specific for our climate and the soils here that would make it hard for worms, but then just any sort of creepy crawlies to live here? Ground freezes, yeah, cold. A big thing is cold and moisture. Anything else we can think about? Nope. Oh. To throw out some terms, our soil type that we have here known as a soil order, and soil order is basically just a broad definition of different types of soils in different areas. There's a ton of them that I had to learn last quarter about. There's entasols, inceptisols, histosols, aridosols, all these different sort of sols, that's what they call them. There's something sols. And what we have specifically here, which you can see on the paper, are spotosols. Spotosols. Everyone just scream that really quickly. Spotosols! Spotosols. S-P-O-D-O-S-O-L-S. Spotosols. And they're supposed to be defined to remember them as the OD in there, they're odd soils, and that's mainly because of their high acidity, which is characteristic of spotosols. The reason for that is okay, no worries. The reason for that is because of the conifer trees that usually inhabit the soils, and the needles that come down there as they're weathered and decay into the soil are highly acidic and make the soils acidic as well. And as we talked about before, they are characterized by being in cold, wet, moist climates, and that is something that is not really well for earthworms in general. Earthworms don't like to go into soils of acidity higher than a 4, or lower, I guess, however you look at it. 4, once it gets to 4, they're done with that. which is odd because they make soil slightly acidic. So it's kind of like a weird thing. They don't like acidic soils, but they still make them slightly acidic. And they also just don't like the cold and the wet. As we know, whenever it rains, they all come to the top because they can't breathe underwater. So it's kind of a harsh environment for them to be living in, with this constant cold and this constant rain that is making them come up to the surface. Let's see. And getting into more specifics of the soil that we have here, spodosols, we can look at the soil profile. Basically, what the soil profile is just the makeup and the layering of the soils that we can look at. And what those are broken up to, just briefly going over them, this is something that you can look on the facts on the little term sheet right there, but then also research a little bit more on if you want to know more about it. They are broken up into what are called horizons, so they're just the horizontal planes of where you can see them change. The top one is the O horizon, and that's just the decaying organic material, all the leaf litter on top there. It's usually followed by in our case of spodosols, a really thin A horizon, and the A horizon is just that processed organic material. So that's the worm poop. Those are the casts. That's like more rich nutrient at the top, but it's not always seen in some areas, especially in Western Washington soils. In spodosols, it's rather thin, and that's because we don't have that many of the little critters in the ground that's breaking up and turning that organic material into the A horizon. So we have thicker O horizons, and then what we have is the underlying E horizon layer, and then under that a B horizon layer, which is defined on the term sheets. But it's really important to look at, and I'm going to walk around with the picture in just a second, showing what it looks like. The E horizon is grayish white. That's how it's the easiest one to notice and visibly see, and that's just because of all the leaching that has happened from the heavy rain in our forests and the acidity. So basically, as the rainfall comes down, chemical and physical weathering is occurring very small scale, and it's taking the organic nutrients and the minerals out of that E horizon layer, taking them down in a process called alluviation with an E, so it's exiting that E horizon area and then illuviating with an I into the next layer of the B horizon. So alluviation out and then eluviation into those different layers, and that's a process called, and I said it earlier incorrectly before I said leaching, because leaching of a soil complex has to have the nutrients completely exit the soil profile. So in a lot of cases we see the materials leave the E horizon and then they'll end up in the B horizon right underneath it, but that is just a transfer of nutrients and minerals. If it was to be leached, then it would be completely exiting the soil profile, likely ending up in a groundwater in the water table below and then being wished away somewhere else, and that is leaching. And that's a process that's sort of hurts our forests and our soils because of the heavy rain and the highly acidic soils. We have a lot of leaching, which makes spodosols not really a fertile soil. It's a low fertile soil. You can use it because we have that O horizon and a good A horizon, but a lot of the soils, once you get to the E horizon, it's basically completely nutrient deprived and hard to use. And I'm gonna walk around now because a really cool thing about E horizons, if you look here, on here, you can see the transfer between the E and the B horizon right there. You can see how it's hard to see. I'm gonna walk all the way back there and it's all gray. Light colored E horizon right there, and you can also notice that it's not just a straight line. It's not necessarily, you know, a clear chain.
Yeah, just like.
Yes, that is actually completely correct.
Oh, cool.
That is the answer to it. So the reason why it creates in this wavy pattern is just because of how much material is being leached or moved out of that E horizon. So if you have an area maybe that has a divot or is low lying and collects a lot of rainwater, usually typically pools up, or you have a slope that brings all the rainwater down to enter into one system, and then it moves down from there, you're gonna have a much higher level of leaching and corrosive. One second, I just need to breathe. There we go. You're gonna have a higher level of erosion going on, in that single area, just because you have a higher rate of water moving through there, the minerals are going out of there, so you're going to see the E horizon sort of jab down in those areas just because it's had a higher rate of weathering. But if you have an area that's maybe covered by rocks, a building or impermeable surface like a clay material, a clay soil, that is doesn't allow water to move through it, then you're going to have less erosive qualities in that area. So the B horizon is going to be lifted up a little bit, and you're going to have a skinnier E horizon. Yeah, those are spot swells, and those are how the wavy pattern of it can be found. I'm really sad, couldn't find any good cross sections of the soil profile, and like all this stuff sucks because it's just all the top material just kind of washed down, so it's not really showing a good clear cut on Susha. There's a really good part on the coast where it just looks like it's been completely taken out of it and just has a perfect, you can see the O horizon, you can see the little tiny A horizon, you can see a nice gray E horizon going across it and the B horizon right below it. It's beautiful. I saw it, I was like, oh, this is just wonderful, I'm going to use this. So hopefully I can remember where it is and find it.
Take a picture of it.
I should have taken a picture of it. Jordan, thank
But
you.
you can when you go back.
I will. Let's see. Now from the crawlies, and now that we know a little bit about the soil profile, I want to talk about a certain scenario that can happen in Western Washington ecosystems that affects the soil and also greatly affects that sort of wavy pattern that we see with the E and the B horizons. And that is something that we can see behind us. Everyone stand up and turn around! Over here! A root ball. We do have a root ball. Very beautiful. Really nice.
Of an oak tree, maple tree.
I was hoping to find a bigger one that I could climb up on and play with, but this was the only one that was really close. This is what we have here is tree uprooting, and it is very common in our forests, specifically with something to do with our soils. Does anyone know the factors that can lead to this?
Too much moisture.
Too much moisture, yes.
Disease.
Disease, yeah, that could affect it. Anything else?
Wind.
Wind, moisture, anything else?
Termites.
Termites could, yes. Specifically for ours, in this case, is the most common case for it is a factor of high winds, which are prevalent in our areas in Western, as we know, and then a overabundance of nutrients and rainwater at the surface of the soils, which we just have a lot of, luckily, but it causes all of our trees to have really shallow rooting systems. So for most trees in arid environments, they'll have what is called a taproot, and that's basically just a really long, thick root that'll shoot straight down, trying to find groundwater or some sort of reservoir to use, and it's really good as an anchor to protect itself against falling over. But with our heavy rains and really nutrient topsoils, our trees don't need to have those taproots, so they're really shallow rooting systems, which make them susceptible for high winds and toppling over, which creates this right here, which is so small and so tiny and seems just like a quick little thing right there, but is pretty big for the soil complex that we have in these forests. So I flip my sheet over. So basically what we have here are these root systems, and these root systems can be huge. Like this is just a small little tree, and, you can see all this stuff that's got topped up. But I'm sure we've seen sometimes before, especially out in Susha, I saw a few things where there's these massive trees and these huge amounts of earth that get flipped up with it, because these root systems can be huge. In some trees, you can have 50 to 60% of the tree's body mass be from the roots that are in there. So that's just a huge amount of material that is getting ripped up with it. For it to be a tree uprooting, the majority of their major roots have to stay intact and come up with the tree. Otherwise, it's just going to be the trunk snapping, and it's not necessarily the same effect that we see here. And what this does, I'm going to stand up because squatting's hard. What we have here is a little microclimate that occurs because it's just from this little tiny change and shift of soils, it creates a ton of different scenarios that's happening in there. You know, just from looking at this, we can see that now we have soils that were completely covered down there before. They could have been into the E horizon, or in some cases, you know, it goes all the way down into the B horizon, and all of a sudden now that's flipped up into the air, rotated around, churning that soil about and changing it in some cases. A lot of times if it happens so prevalent in one area, if you have like a wind burst that knocks over a ton of trees and uproots them, it can actually set back our soil order from a spot of soil because it'll mix it all up and create sort of the starting soils, which is an entisol, which is defined on the term sheet, and that is just the youngest soil order that we can have, and that's just typical on any sort of disturbed area, usually from a landslide or from something like this. But it'll create the different scenarios in there, just from having wind relief, sun relief, heat relief, you know, moisture buildup in certain areas, what can grow there. If you have all the soil that's pulled up being from the E horizon, you know, in the patch over here, you're not going to have that much growth because there's not that many nutrients, or if it's a ton of rocks get pulled up, you know, it's going to just change what can grow in that area and how it's formed. Or if it's, you know, springs up and then all of a sudden you just have this new unearthed B horizon that's super rich in a whole bunch of minerals and stuff, it's going to fuel a lot of different plants to grow there. So it's just kind of an interesting thing that I wanted to highlight on because it's actually it's very prevalent in our forest and sort of specific to our forest, which is pretty cool. And then yeah, you can see in the sometimes when you look and you see those wavy E and B horizon layers, you can actually predict if there have been tree falls in the past above ground, because if you just see heavy areas where the E horizon shoots down, that usually means that there was a pooling area right there, and you can sometimes predict that there was a tree there. And then it makes our forest, when you walk around, get that really kind of hilly, weird textured in areas that you know, covered with ferns. You wonder, like, oh, why is it super bumpy? And maybe you'll see like some decaying logs around you and some roots sticking up, and that's just because in the past there were trees there, they got knocked over by the wind, changed up all the soil complex of it, you know, and then you get this sort of wavy, bumpy feeling to it. And that's it, basically.